housing and a poor outlook for housing is not really proving to be a vote loser. That's the reality. I think a good housing policy, incidentally, could be a vote winner, especially in certain areas. But bad housing policy is not really a vote loser at the moment. So what we need is massive increase in house building. And the truth is, the public purse is not going to pay for a massive increase in house building. A massive increase in house building is going to come about because of private investment. It was very narrow in its focus of what the solution was to decarbonising buildings. So a huge amount of emphasis put on heat pumps, for instance, at the expense of really everything else. You go out here on the street and you pick a random person and say, you got £15,000 spare. What are they going to say? They're going to say, no mate, sorry, I don't have that. Because who does? If we were sitting here in 5 years having the same discussion, I can't honestly say I'd be shocked. The party that eventually beats the SNP, I don't think that party exists yet.
Hello, it's Paul and it's
Megan.
Newly married.
Yes, back from my time off.
Good to see you again. And it's the ESPC show, I forgot to add. It was the wedding show.
Yeah, today we've got quite an exciting episode, and an episode that we always look forward to. We're chatting to Andy Maciver, who is the founder and director of Message Matters, and we're talking all things Scottish politics.
Absolutely, yeah. We cover it all from where we are now, election predictions, goes into some detail about the housing policies as well, heating buildings, housing bill,
rent control. Yeah,
it's all covered.
Yeah, so without further ado, we'll just pass over to our conversation with Andy.
So we are 1 year away from the Scottish elections. How exciting.
Yes.
And we thought it would be a great time to talk to Andy Maciver, founder of Message Matters, director of Message Matters as well, and here to talk about all things political landscape, seeing where we are now, where we might be going. Shall we get started?
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, Andy, as Paul mentioned, it's a year to go till the Scottish election. We thought the first thing we should ask you is, what's the political mood like in Scotland right now?
I suppose it depends who you ask. Bad and good, depending on who you ask. I think where we are is that it's been a pretty turbulent year. So we've had Labour winning the election by quite a distance, at least in terms of seats in Scotland. But I think the giveaway of what happened last July in the general election is that they didn't actually win in vote share by that much over the SNP. So they polled like 35%. The SNP still polled 30%. And I think what we've seen over the last year is the Scottish population, if you look at the polls, the Scottish population have made a judgment, as they have done before, that they will vote in a general election based on basically how to get rid of the Tory party at Westminster. That's basically what, and they've done it before. This has happened in many general elections. But they did that, and the answer to that question is you get rid of the Tory party by voting for the Labour Party. So they did, and Labour won, 38 seats or something. But the calculation at a Scottish Parliament election is different. The calculation at the Scottish Parliament election is who stands up for Scotland. And it looks, judging by the polls, like the answer again will be the SNP for the fifth time. Okay. Now it's pretty amazing.
Yeah.
If you look at, look around the democratic world.
I was about to say it's a hell of a tenure, isn't it?
It's unbelievable. It's going to be a quarter of a century. Wow. If they win again next year, they'll be until 2031, and that will be 24 years since they first won 5 terms. That doesn't happen anywhere else in the democratic world.
No.
Doesn't happen anywhere else. And it's not so much that the SNP are massively popular, because they're not really, and they probably will lose seats compared to what they got in 2021. They're not that popular. They're just the least unpopular of all the parties. And that is proving enough for them to win. And I suppose if the answer to your question, Megan, what the political mood is like, the political mood is very good if you speak to people at Reform UK. Because even in Scotland, against lots of expectations, they are doing quite well. At least the polls will say that they're doing quite well. They don't even have a leader in Scotland.
I was going to ask, who's the face?
Nigel Farage says he's going to lead the Scottish campaign.
Okay.
So they don't even have a leader.
It's going to be busy, isn't it?
And yet they're still doing well. And in fact, the last poll that was done, which was 2 weeks ago, or thereabouts, had Reform on 20% of the vote and 23 seats, which would be enough to get them second place in the election. So this is where it's playing into the hands of the SNP as well. Not only have you got that thing where people are saying who stands up for Scotland, and they're answering the SNP in greater numbers than they're answering anybody else, But the vote is also splintering because Reform are taking votes from Labour and they're taking votes from the Tories. The only party they're not taking any votes from is the SNP.
So, do you think there'll be a coalition then, or do you think it will be?
Whether it's a formal coalition or just an agreement, who knows? We'll see. But the way things are shaping up...
Too?
Well, so that's an interesting question. Because if you asked somebody in the SNP, if you spoke to a government advisor 6 months ago, they would say we're not going anywhere near the Greens.
Yeah,
I'm not going to touch them with a barge pole. That was a nightmare. Look at all the policies that all went wrong. It's all their fault. And now we're out of it and we're not going back. They would say that. The difference now is that the Green leadership has resigned. And there's going to be a leadership election in the Green Party this summer. So I think we've got to watch out for who wins that leadership election. If it's somebody who's deemed to be more pragmatic,
more moderate,
more able to be worked with, then you might find that the SNP take another look at them. But the SNP have got another option, which is the Liberal Democrats. So they worked with the Lib Dems in the last budget, and they worked really well with them in the last budget. They were pretty happy to work with them as well. And the way things are shaping up, the SNP plus either the Greens or the Lib Dems might be just about enough to get over the 65 seats they would need for a majority, which will help them pass their budgets and help them pass legislation and so on. So there's more than likely going to have to be some sort of arrangement, which is what's supposed to happen under proportional representation anyway. There's more than likely going to have to be some sort of arrangement, whether it's a coalition or whether it's something less formal. Who knows? We'll wait and see. So that's where it's sort of sitting. But obviously things are looking decent for the SNP, but in the long term they've still got to look at what is generally sort of falling popularity and what does it do to independence and all that sort of stuff. And I think Labour will have to ask themselves, if they do lose in the way that it looks like they're going to have to ask themselves a much more fundamental question, which is, can we actually ever win? With the structures we've got in place and with the fact that people vote based on what Westminster Labour is doing, not based on what Scottish Labour is doing. Can we actually ever win? I think the answer to that is probably no. I don't think the party that, put it this way, the party that eventually beats the SNP, I don't think that party exists yet. I think that the party that beats the SNP will have to emerge. It will be a party that only operates in the Scottish Parliament, be a Scottish party for Scotland, in Scotland, not necessarily a pro-independence party. In fact, it's more likely to be a pro-UK party, but it'll be a pro-UK party that only operates in the Scottish Parliament and doesn't have any association with any Westminster parties. That's the party that will end up beating the SNP.
And we've ruled ourselves out, I think, haven't we, Megan? We were just chatting.
Probably not for us. Not for this election, anyway. So obviously housing is where our expertise lies, but looking towards the manifesto creation for the parties going forward, do you think there's going to be any housing related policies come forward?
I think everybody will have pretty substantial sections in their manifesto that are about housing. So I think it's less a question of whether they'll talk about it, because they will.
It's how they
diverge. What will they actually say about it that means anything?
And that they'll do.
I think that's the question. So everybody's going to say, we need to build more houses. Everybody's going to say that. But we all know that. What's actually happening? Have they actually managed to create a policy or an idea of a policy that will help deliver that? Are they looking at the speed of the planning system and seeing if that has anything to do with it? Are they looking at land and seeing if that has anything to do with it? Are they looking at investment criteria and opportunities and seeing what that... Are they really digging into it? Or is it just a superficial, we've got a problem, we're going to fix it? So my feeling at the moment is that that's pretty much where they are. And the truth is, at the moment, housing and a poor outlook for housing is not really proving to be a vote loser. That's the reality. I think a good housing policy, incidentally, could be a vote winner, especially in certain areas. But bad housing policy is not really a vote loser at the moment. I mean, it is, there are certain... Obviously, if you look at something like the PRS and rent caps, and we'll get on to talking about rent caps, that is unquestionably a vote loser amongst certain subsets of the population who are quite deeply affected by it and who understand the consequences of rent caps. But in the grand scheme of the electorate, that's a really small number. So I don't think that I don't think there's a massive incentive at the moment to rock the boat with a big new and potentially quite controversial housing policy. Now we need that. because it's one of the existential issues that's facing the country and the economy over the next 50 years. So we do need one, but it could be quite hard, and it could be quite controversial, and some people might get upset by it.
Yeah.
And if you're the government and you're, as we just discussed, 20 points ahead in the polls and sailing to another election victory, why would you want to upset people?
Yeah.
Deliberately.
Yeah.
You wouldn't do it, would you?
We're going to build on green belts, or we're going to do this.
You're not going to. You're going to just let things lie.
Play safe,
and play it safe. And I think, broadly speaking, that is where we are with that. And it's not a massively optimistic message to give. The flip side, though, is that it means it's a good time over the next year or so to really start to lobby and to say things about what you think needs done, not because you necessarily expect them to be announced in a manifesto before the election, but maybe it will help to create better policy after the election when the government's got a new 5-year runway to do hard things. It's not going to do hard things a year before, but it might do hard things in the 5 years after.
I mean, at some point, as you've said, we need to do hard things because there's been the housing emergency declared last May, I think it was. If we were marking the scorecard for the government in the last year, I think I would give them a D.
Well,
That's what I used to get from your levels.
Was the housing emergency declared in order to make it look as though action had been taken? I would say probably yes.
I would suspect so.
And that's a pretty old political trick.
Yeah.
Is that you...
It's disappointing though, isn't it?
Because you say something and you consider the box to be ticked because you've made an announcement, or because you've announced a consultation, or because you've thought about a policy. You say, well, that's the issue fixed. Actually, it's not, because on the ground, nothing's different.
Nothing's changed.
Nothing's different. So and I think that's where we are. And I don't expect that we'll see anything different in the next year either. But I think that the optimistic side of me says, okay, let's accept that we're probably not going to see a shift in the next year because there's no political incentive to make one. But we might see a shift straight after the election because there is a political incentive to make one by then, because we then get to 2031. And frankly, we can't cope with there having not been a massive expansion in house building in the next 6 years. So, we might get something there.
So what, I mean, you're sort of touching upon it there, maybe elaborate a little bit on what you think we might see, as you say, when they get that 5-year runway, whoever it is, what you think we might see?
Well, they've ultimately, what the government, whatever the government is, whether it's another SNP government or a Labour-led government, and indeed I would include the Lib Dems in this, because I think fundamentally, if you look at, let's take 3 politicians from those 3 parties, okay, let's talk about Kate Forbes, Deputy First Minister and Economy Minister, Daniel Johnson, who's her Labour shadow, and Willie Rennie, who's her Lib Dem shadow. Now, fundamentally, I think all 3 of those people think pretty much the same way about this issue, which is that they all understand that we need to find a creative way to make sure more property of all sorts of different tenure,
all across the tenure,
is built.
And
I think they fundamentally also know that we need to make sure we are open and ready for international private investment into that property. And furthermore, I think they know that our current policies, particularly rent controls, make us pretty unattractive.
Absolutely.
So I think they know this. And I think the sector can work with that. They can work with that knowledge. They can work with the fact that those 3 important people from different parties fundamentally understand the game here. And they understand what's going wrong. I just think the incentive for them to do a great deal about it
just now
comes probably because of the nature of what you would have to do. And the nature of the sort of argument you would have to make as well. Because what you're saying is to make rented property, if we talk about rented property, to make rented property in particular, private rented property, to make it more affordable, you need more private, not less private. Now, that is the reality, and we know that's how you do it. But politically, I don't think they want the nuance involved in that argument. Nuance doesn't win elections. Nuance doesn't win elections.
So rent controls, rent caps.
So we know how to solve
artificial devices.
Rent controls are irrelevant if you've got enough supply.
Absolutely.
Because if you've got enough supply, the market right sizes itself anyway. Not difficult, like first year economics at school. Okay, It's too much supply. It's too much demand, not enough supply. What do? Increase supply. Done.
Yeah.
Right.
And we're seeing it in certain little pockets of the lettings market, well, at the top end, where landlords have, once there was the restriction lifted, have over-egged what they're looking for. Not getting it.
Yeah, not getting it.
So what do they have to do?
Yeah.
Bring down rents.
Yeah.
So the market forces are kind of at play.
Yeah. And we understand where it's coming from as well. Because this is an expensive country to have a roof over your head.
Yeah.
Because our salaries, our wages and salaries in this country are not really high enough to sustain the cost of property, whether that's mortgage costs, rental costs, whatever it might be. So we are out of sync here.
Absolutely out of sync.
And so you get where it's coming from, because MSPs will be in their mailboxes all the time, will be people who are saying, my son and daughter, they just can't get on the housing ladder, it's just too expensive. They've gone into a job where they're earning £25,000 a year as their starter salary, and we thought it was a good job, and we think that's a decent salary as a starter salary. So how can they afford to buy, a first-time buyer's house in Edinburgh when it's £320,000? Yeah. And it's a difficult question for politicians to answer, because the answer is, well, they can't afford that. Those numbers don't add up.
I was just looking at my stats there. This is from a conference I attended the other day, talking about affordability, saying it's similar to what it was in 1874. Yeah. When it really was the them and us, wasn't it? Those that owned property and those that didn't. And as I say, that's not, at that point we are in a housing emergency crisis, call it what you will,
So what we need is massive increase in house building.
Absolutely.
And the truth is, the public purse is not going to pay for a massive increase in house building. A massive increase in house building is going to come about because of private investment. Mm-hmm. That's what's going to happen. Yeah. It's the only way it's going to work. And at some point, politicians are going to have to say, here's the way the world works, folks.
Yeah.
This is how we're going to do it.
Yeah, and as you say, it's got to be the right environment, isn't it, for that investment, because we're not the only part of the UK where people can invest. Simple as that, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I think we've touched on rent controls and landlord legislation. Shall we move on to the climate?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
You need to fix that next, Andy.
The climate, the whole climate. Yeah, okay.
So obviously, no pun intended, a hot topic just now is obviously the heat and buildings bill.
Yes.
What is the latest on that?
The sequel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's the latest on that? Well, there's going to be one. That's the sort of headline of what the latest is on that. So the first one was scrapped. Mm-hmm. The first one was created under the coalition government, or the cooperation agreement government between the SNP and the Greens. The feeling within the SNP side of the government was that it was an unrealistic document, an unrealistic aim, because so much, well, for a couple of reasons. It was very narrow in its focus of what the solution was to decarbonising buildings. So a huge amount of emphasis put on heat pumps, for instance, at the expense of really everything else. Yeah. And also, there was no real proper thought given as to how to make it happen in practice and how to afford it. So, you go out here on the street and you pick a random person and say, you got £15,000 spare. What are they going to say? They're going to say, no, mate, sorry, I don't have that. Because who does? Okay?
No.
And so, for all those reasons, it was got rid of. The new one, I think, will be different, because I think that the SNP have realised that it is decarb. The biggest emitters in the country are domestic housing and domestic transport. These are the things that, I know we like to think it's getting to the airport and going to Mallorca, but it's not. It's domestic transport and domestic housing, and actually everything else is tiny in comparison to these two things. So you do need to decarbonise. There isn't any question about that. I think that the new Heat and Buildings Bill will be a more realistic document and a more realistic interpretation of how to actually do it. But I think ultimately it's still going to involve money. It's still in it. The retrofitting homes is going to be expensive. And so I think they've got to ask themselves the question of who's going to pay for this. Now, and as you know, I do some work with Paul Denton in Scottish Building Society, who's got a lot of interesting things to say about this. Because
is this where we're going to talk about green mortgages here?
Yeah, well, see, the thing is, I think what they would say, I don't want to speak for Paul Denton, but I think what Paul Denton would say is actually it's not about green mortgages. This is a home improvement.
Yeah.
Just like getting a new driveway.
Yeah.
Is it home improvement?
Yeah.
And lenders are in the business of lending for home improvement.
Yeah, if they feel that investment's safe and secure,
Exactly,
and we've not seen it yet, but you would argue in the future that will you see an increase in the value of a home if you put on solar panels or you switch?
So that's the sort of thing that you need to, and you
Yeah.
need to think about that in a more strategic way
Yes.
if you're the government. So somebody's going to have to pay for homes to be retrofitted. So as far as I can tell, there are three sources of funding for it. There's the government. The government are not going to... How many homes are there in Scotland? 2 million homes? 2.5 million homes?
Mm-hmm.
Government's not retrofitting 2.5 million homes. Wouldn't have any money left to spend on anything else. People themselves, by dipping into their pocket. Now, some people will be able to do that, but the percentage of people who can do that's probably quite small.
And there may be other things they'd want to prioritise right now,
So
unfortunately.
the third option is lending.
Yeah.
Just like we do for anything else.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing. That's actually good for the lenders as well, because they increase their book.
Yeah.
Potentially, if they're lending to existing customers, it's pretty safe lending. They've been getting their mortgage paid for 15 years safely, and they get another £100 a month on the mortgage, which, by the way, some of which will come off their bills, their heating bills, so maybe not as expensive as they might think. And to me, that's the obvious way to do this.
The only way.
But how many times have you actually heard the government talking about that? I haven't.
No, it's the usual. The market will find a way, and we probably will. But we need to know what the environment is, what's being said, and there's been so much uncertainty around this bill.
Yeah, exactly. And again, it opens up opportunities. So you guys and your estate agent members are going to be selling homes. Inevitably, as this carries forward over the coming years, a big part of the metrics of people, they're going to be looking at the home report, and then at the moment they say, does that roof need redone? What's that like? In a few years they're going to be saying, what's the heating system?
Yeah, it's becoming more. I mean, we're seeing it more now. People are paying a lot more attention to the energy reports.
So that's all good. That's all quite a natural progression.
It has to be, and I think the generation that are coming up now, that those things are more important to maybe they are to the... I don't like to use the word boomers, but I think it's a fact, that those things are more important to the people that are going to be here in 20 and 30 and 50 years' time.
Yes, it's more important from... And I think we should be clear as well, those people, they look at it from an environmental point of view, yes, because if you are under 40, you are much more likely to be more environmentally aware than if you're over 40. But let's not be, let's be brutal. They're looking at it from a cost point of view as well. People look to the wallet before they look to the climate. That's the reality. Yeah. Even if they're 20, they still do that. That's
still why important. I think there's always going to be an element of taxation about this. So incentivised taxation.
Yeah. Well, this is where the heat and buildings bill has got to be about more than. It's got to be much more multi-dimensional than the last one was. If it's really going to be strategic about saying, right, by 2045 or 2050, we need all the homes to be decarbonised. Well, that's not just about saying, I quite fancy heat pumps. That's about saying, hold on a second here. There's an awful lot to take into account here. We need to be speaking to builders, we need to speak to developers, we need to speak to agents, we need to speak to lenders, a whole range of people who are all going to be critical to actually making this successful. It's not that hard if you actually sit down and think about it properly.
Yeah, agreed.
So, we'll see.
Wow, absolutely. So I think, as we mentioned, we wanted to speak about this because we've got a year to go.
Yes.
We also wondered if we could get some predictions from you. So what's your boldest political prediction for between now and May 2026?
Good question. I think that it's going to be a messy parliament after. So I think it may not fit into the bracket of boldest prediction, but it's going to be a messy parliament afterwards, and I think it's going to demand quite a lot of co-working between various different parties and between various different people within the parties, and there are opportunities to be gained from the mess that's going to come. So I think the people who are going to thrive the most are those who are ready to grasp some of those opportunities. Maybe work in a cross-constitutional way, maybe unionists working with nationalists, nationalists working with unionists. Because I think the opportunities will come from this next parliament to do things a bit better and to make things work based on what the country actually needs rather than the kind of old constitutional arguments and old cross-party arguments that have existed before. So I think there are opportunities to be gained for it. So, for example, taking it back to housing. one thing that I think the housing sector has been crying out for is a dedicated cabinet secretary.
Absolutely.
Okay, so at the moment we've got a housing minister, Paul McLennan, but that ministry falls under the cabinet secretary for social justice. Now, the social justice portfolio has the entirety of Scotland's welfare system in it. It's got the equalities brief in it. I think it's got elements of child poverty in it, which is the First Minister's sort of primary mission. So where's housing? Is housing really round that cabinet table in the way that it's supposed to be? Now, if you look at what affects people, normal people on a day-to-day basis, housing, transport, these are the key things that really impact people. Transport has made it to the cabinet table after quite a long time. And I know
there's not a transport emergency.
Right. So I know it sounds superficial, and I know it sounds like it's more of a process issue. I actually think it's really important to put housing round that cabinet table, because it means that it is centre of discussions as opposed to periphery to discussions in cabinet. And secondly, it means that there has to be an element of civil service organisation around a directorate on housing, where it's not just a sort of secondary or tertiary thought, but it's a primary thought. I think that the sort of opportunity that I think might arise by what I said was a messy parliament afterwards is for housing associations, local authorities, the owned sector, like you guys partially represent, the rented sector, to all come together and say, and builders, by the way, and lenders, to come together and say, to all the parties and say, we want a commitment after the election that you're actually going to put a cabinet secretary for housing, full stop, nothing else in the title, cabinet secretary for housing, round that table after the election. That's the sort of opportunity that I think could be eked out in this pretty messy politics that we've got over the next year or so.
Okay, interesting. I agree. I think we've been saying it for a good while. Should happen. Should have happened already.
Another prediction we were wondering about was, what is one thing you think will definitely change about housing policy after the election?
I don't think I'm confident enough to say that one thing will definitely change about housing policy. So if we were sitting here in 5 years having the same discussion, I can't honestly say I'd be shocked at that. I think there's a chance things could change, because as I said before, there are enough important people in enough important places to understand that things aren't going well. So I think there's a chance that things could change. With sensible representation from the sector and probably a little bit more coherence from the sector generally as well, I think there's a chance. But no, I am not confident enough to say that I'm certain anything actually will, unfortunately. I don't like giving that answer, but that's the truth.
And if that is the case, what's the housing market look like?
Well, it just looks like it looks just now, but a little bit worse, right? Everything's a bit, rents are more expensive. The earnings to accommodation price is worse. Ratio is worse than it was before. Everything is just a little bit worse again than it is just now, and we kind of go round in circles having the same conversation.
And we are getting to that real pinch point, aren't we, where it's now impacted on who people can employ, because people can't need to be within half an hour and 45 minutes of where they work, and they can't because of prices. And these are all the problems we saw in London.
And you guys will see this. I see this running my business. I have lots of staff who don't live in Edinburgh. It's expensive. It's really, really expensive to live here. So this needs to be looked at in a much more rounded way. And indeed that's another part of the reason why I think housing should be around that cabinet table. Housing has a key interchange with transport, for instance.
And business.
We're walking around Edinburgh today. How many people live in the City of Edinburgh Council area? How many people live in the Fife Council area? How many people live in the Scottish Borders Council area? This transport comes into this equation as well, especially as we're trying to, kind of get house prices that suit individual and it's affordable for individual people. So there's a lot at play here, and I just don't think that we have that level of coherence at government level, and I don't think we get that level of coherence before an election, because as I said before, elections are not about nuance. Elections are about megaphones. But maybe we can get that level of coherence immediately after it, If we're ready and
we're
prepared as a sector,
yeah,
and unified as a sector, maybe we can get more coherence afterwards than we have before.
Okay. And I think he's already answered the final question.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice place to kind of wrap up. Thank you so much, Andy, for coming on.
Yeah,
nice to be here again.
As ever, stimulating and heartfelt, and yeah, you never pull any punches, and it's hard to disagree with anything you said, Andy. So yeah, thank you for your time.
Good to see you both.
Brilliant. I tell you what, I enjoyed that.
Yeah, it was a really good chat, and I think very interesting to see what the next 12 months hold for us.
He knows his stuff, doesn't he?
Absolutely.
He does know his stuff, and I think what I picked up is that probably not much is going to change in terms of the housing emergency right now, but then maybe with that 5-year runway, if there's a will, you might see some radical thinking.
Yeah,
He's
fingers
not sure
crossed.
though, is he?
Yeah, fingers crossed.
Come on, guys, you can do it. Let's solve this crisis.
As always, if you enjoyed today's episode, please follow us or subscribe to us wherever you're watching or listening. You can also follow us on our social media channels. And if you really, really enjoyed this episode, we'd love it if you could share it with someone you think would also enjoy it.
Someone special.
But otherwise, we'll be back in a fortnight.
We certainly will. Thanks for listening. Oh, and it's all lighting up on TikTok, and we're getting lots of comments and questions. So please keep them coming, and again, we'll try and answer them in the show as and when. But until next time, great to see you. Thanks for watching. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.